The afternoon sun beat down on my backyard as Officer Martinez stood at the edge of my pool trying to keep a straight face. Karen, our self-appointed HOA president, jabbed her finger toward the crystal-clear water like she was presenting evidence in court. She said with a shrill voice, "This is unauthorized private usage of community property. I demand you arrest him immediately." The officer glanced at me, then back at Karen, clearly wondering how he'd gotten dragged into this mess. That's when I calmly reached into my folder and pulled out the property deed. As I handed it over, I could already see the corners of his mouth twitching. Karen had no idea she was about to become the neighborhood's biggest joke. It all started 3 months earlier when I moved into this quiet suburban paradise. The 4-bedroom colonial wasn't the fanciest house on the block, but that backyard pool sealed the deal for me. After years of apartment living, I couldn't wait to float on a pool raft with a cold drink, enjoying my own private oasis. The previous owners had installed it 15 years ago, and the sparkling blue water practically called my name during the walkthrough. I signed the papers without hesitation, already planning weekend barbecues and evening swims. My first week in the neighborhood seemed perfect. Neighbors waved from their driveways, kids rode bikes down the streets, and everything felt like a scene from a family sitcom. Then came the knock on my door. Standing there was a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a clipboard clutched to her chest like a weapon. She announced with practiced authority, "Welcome to Willowbrook Estates. I'm Karen Henderson, president for life of our HOA." The way she said president for life should have been my first warning. She handed me a thick packet of rules and regulations. Then her eyes drifted past me to the backyard visible through my living room. Her smile grew wider, almost predatory. "Oh, how wonderful. You'll be maintaining the community pool. It's such a blessing to have that common space available for all our residents." I blinked, certain I had misheard her. "I'm sorry, what? That's my pool." "It came with the house," Karen laughed, a tinkling sound that made my skin crawl. She said with a condescending tone, "Oh dear, there must be some confusion. That pool has always been considered a neighborhood amenity. The previous owners were so generous about sharing. I'm sure you'll continue that tradition." Before I could respond, she was already walking away, calling over her shoulder about the next HOA meeting. I stood there, packet in hand, wondering what alternate dimension I'd stumbled into. The next few weeks taught me that Karen's interpretation of community pool meant she had free reign over my backyard. I'd come home from work to find her lounging on my deck chairs, sipping lemonade like she owned the place. One Saturday morning, I woke up to splashing sounds and discovered she'd let herself through my gate to do water aerobics. She said cheerfully when she saw me, "Good morning, just getting my exercise in. The water temperature is perfect today." I was too stunned to do anything but stare as she continued her routine, completely oblivious to my discomfort. Things escalated when Karen started scheduling community swim hours without asking me. She posted flyers around the neighborhood announcing that the pool would be open to all residents on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The first time it happened, I came home to find 8 strangers in my backyard, kids cannonballing into the deep end while their parents chatted on my patio. Karen stood there like a camp counselor, wearing a whistle around her neck. She beamed at me and said, "Isn't this wonderful, building community bonds?" I politely but firmly told everyone they needed to leave, that this was private property. The other neighbors looked confused and embarrassed, quickly gathering their things. Karen's face turned red as she huffed, "You're being very selfish. This goes against everything our HOA stands for." After that incident, I installed a better lock on my gate. The next morning, I found a note taped to it, written in Karen's perfect cursive. "You are in violation of HOA Regulation 7.3 regarding community access to shared amenities. Remove this lock immediately or face fines." I crumpled the note and tossed it in the recycling. 2 days later, another note appeared, this time with laminated pool rules she'd created. "No diving in shallow end. Pool hours are 8:00 a.m. to 8:00 p.m. No glass containers." The audacity of this woman was breathtaking. She was making rules for my pool like she was the aquatics director at the YMCA. I tried talking to other neighbors, hoping to find allies in this bizarre situation. Most just shrugged and said things like, "That's just how Karen is," or "She means well." Tom from two houses down admitted quietly she tried the same thing with my hot tub last year, said it was a community relaxation station. I had to threaten legal action before she backed off. Apparently, Karen had a history of claiming other people's property as communal, but something about my pool had triggered her ultimate power trip. The situation reached a boiling point when I came home early from work with a splitting headache. All I wanted was to lie down in my quiet house. Instead, I found Karen in my backyard with 3 other women, all wearing matching swimsuits and doing synchronized swimming routines. She'd apparently formed an aqua aerobics club. They had a boombox blasting oldies music, and Karen was shouting instructions over the noise. My patience finally snapped. I marched outside and said firmly, "Karen, you need to leave, and don't come back without my permission." She climbed out of the pool with exaggerated dignity, water dripping from her floral swim cap. She said, with venom in her voice, "You're making a big mistake. The HOA board will hear about this." Her retaliation was swift and ridiculous. 2 days later, I was working from home when I heard a knock at the door. Officer Martinez stood there, looking apologetic, while Karen hovered behind him, arms crossed triumphantly. She'd actually called 911 to report me for restricting HOA access to community amenities. The officer asked calmly, "Sir, I need to ask you a few questions about pool access." I could tell he was trying to take this seriously, but his eyes betrayed his confusion. Karen pushed past him into my foyer and announced dramatically, "This man is violating our HOA charter. That pool is designated community property, and he's selfishly hoarding it." Several neighbors had wandered out to their lawns, drawn by the drama. This was better than their afternoon soap operas. I held up a finger and said, "Officer, I'll be right back." I walked to my home office and retrieved the folder I'd been smart enough to prepare after Karen's first few intrusions. Inside was my property deed, the original survey and documentation from the title company. I handed it to Officer Martinez and said, calmly, "As you can see, the pool is entirely on my property. It was installed by the previous owners in 2009, which was 3 years before the HOA was even established." The officer studied the documents carefully while Karen peered over his shoulder, her face growing paler by the second. Officer Martinez cleared his throat and read aloud the relevant section. "Property boundaries extend to include all structures and improvements, including the 16x 32F in-ground pool and surrounding deck area." He looked up at Karen with barely concealed amusement. She spluttered desperately, but the intent the previous owners always shared. "It's been understood for years that the pool serves the community." The officer shook his head and said with professional firmness, "Ma'am, intent doesn't override property law. This gentleman owns the pool. If you continue entering his property without permission, you could be charged with trespassing." The gathered neighbors couldn't contain their reactions. Someone snorted with laughter, quickly covering it with a cough. Another whispered loudly, "I told you she was wrong about that pool." Karen's face cycled through several shades of red and purple. She turned to the crowd and pleaded, "You all have enjoyed that pool, tell him." But the neighbors suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Nobody wanted to side with Karen now that the law was clearly against her. Officer Martinez handed me back my documents and said with a hint of a smile, "Sir, you're well within your rights to restrict access to your property. Ma'am, I strongly advise you to respect those boundaries." He gave Karen a formal warning about trespassing and made notes in his report. As the officer drove away, Karen stood frozen on my lawn, her empire crumbling around her. Mrs. Chen from across the street called out, "Karen, we need to talk about your behavior. This has gone too far." Other neighbors nodded in agreement. Tom added firmly, I think it's time we called a special HOA meeting to discuss leadership changes. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She tried to salvage her dignity by saying weakly, This isn't over. I'll review the bylaws. There must be something about implied community usage, but everyone had already started walking away, shaking their heads. The special HOA meeting was held the following Wednesday in the community center. I attended as a concerned homeowner, armed with my deed and the police report. The room was packed with every seat filled, and people standing along the walls. Karen sat at the board table flanked by two other board members who looked uncomfortable. She tried to start with her usual controlling demeanor, but Mrs. Chen interrupted. We're here to vote on your removal from the board, Karen. Your recent actions have embarrassed our community and exposed us to potential legal liability. Karen launched into a defense about preserving community resources and maintaining neighborhood traditions, but nobody was buying it. When she claimed my pool had always been intended for community use, I stood up and presented the documentation. The original HOA charter, which I'd obtained from the county records, made no mention of my property or any pool. The vote was swift and decisive. 28 votes for removal, 2 against, with only Karen and her best friend Deborah supporting her. As the results were announced, Karen's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. She slammed her hand on the table and shouted, You're all making a terrible mistake. I've dedicated 7 years to this community. Tom responded dryly. And in those 7 years, you've tried to claim 3 hot tubs, 2 backyard gazeos, and now a pool. It's time for new leadership. The rail kicker came when our community lawyer, who'd been asked to attend, revealed that Karen had potentially exposed the HOA to a lawsuit with her actions. Her face went white. As he explained, she could be held personally liable for harassment and defamation. But the universe saved the best. Surprise for last. As Karen gathered her things to storm out, the lawyer added casually, Oh, and Karen, while reviewing the property records, we discovered something interesting. Your house at 42 Willow Lane, it's actually outside the HOA boundaries by about 15 FT. You've never technically been eligible to serve on the board. The room erupted in shocked gasps and nervous laughter. Karen stood there, mouth agape, as the truth sank in. She'd been ruling over an HOA she didn't even belong to. Someone in the back muttered, 7 years of her nonsense and she wasn't even supposed to be here. Karen's humiliation was complete. She fled the meeting room, her heels clicking angrily on the linoleum floor. The last thing we heard was her car door slamming and tires squealing as she drove away. 2 weeks later, I was floating peacefully in my pool when my new security system chimed. The speaker I'd installed announced cheerfully, Welcome to private property. This pool is not community property. Have a nice day. I'd programmed it to go off whenever someone approached the gate, just for my own amusement. The privacy fence I'd installed blocked prying eyes, and the security cameras gave me peace of mind. Life was good again in my private oasis. The final blow to Karen came when she received the bill from the HOA's lawyer for the emergency consultation, $5,000, 0 cents that she was personally responsible for, due to her actions outside the scope of her already invalid authority. Tom told me later that he saw her at the grocery store, and when she spotted him, she abandoned her half-full cart and practically ran to her car. Her reign of terror was officially over, and she couldn't even set foot in an HOA meeting to complain about it since she'd never been a legitimate member. As I floated on my pool raft, drink in hand, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. The woman who'd spent years trying to control everyone else's property didn't even own the right to control her own HOA membership. The security speaker chimed again as a delivery truck passed. This pool is not community property. No, Karen, it certainly is.